Well, no mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou, I tēnei ahi ahi. Welcome everybody and good evening. My name is Margaret and my role is the convener of the Housing Action Group, which has been putting on these evenings, so welcome to you all. And thank you for attending the 5th event of what's turning out to be a regular feature in our calendar, exploring alternative housing ideas. We've got lots more to come. First though, some housekeeping. In keeping with level 1 restrictions, I hope you took advantage of the hand sanitizer at the door, and I saw a lot of you took photographs of the little yellow thingy. My phone doesn't do that, so I don't know what it is. As you've booked your house place here tonight, you're also tracked by that, where you were ticked off by Martin as you arrived. In the event of a fire, there are 2 exits, the one that you came through and the one here. And as in the aeroplane, if you're there, you have to open the door. Toilets are to be found going down the hallway to there. Please don't go through the door straight ahead because it makes a very excruciating noise when the alarm goes off, but just hang a left and the toilets are there. In the event of an earthquake, drop, cover and hold is the order of the day. Good luck with that. You'll also need to move away from the glassed areas, and we've got a lot of glass in here, so this end of the room or in the foyer there, or even down the corridor towards the toilets. When the shaking stops, we'll reassess the situation. Oh, sorry, the assembly point in case of a fire is the mall car park over there. And finally, please raise your hand if this is the first time you've visited this venue. My goodness me, we're still coming. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1,000 welcomes to you. Please come again. Keep an eye on Facebook of what South Alive's up to. And you know the children's program is on for these 2 weeks. There's things there for littlies and not so littlies. So welcome and have a look and see all that we do. For your information, the presentations are going to be filmed and will eventually appear on South Alive YouTube channel, where all the previous ones are. You, the audience, will not be filmed though, and so any potential privacy issues are taken care of. Right?
I'm just saying, I didn't know I was getting filmed.
You're not. You would have worn your tiara.
This my pearls.
And tonight's topic, the format is that I will introduce each of the 5 speakers tonight. There is an opportunity for questions from the floor after each speaker, and we ask that you do wait until after the speaker has finished, otherwise it disrupts the flow. And we wind up with a cuppa, finishing the evening hopefully around 9:30, but much depends on you because of the questions. And there may be a short lull between speakers as the technology is set up for each one. Right, so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Maria Grace. Now, Maria is passionate about housing and housing issues. You'll hear her slight European accent that indicates her experience with housing elsewhere outside New Zealand. Maria studied in SIT, gained a job with a builder doing quantity surveying, I think. Oh, good, I got that right. And now is working as a building control officer for ICC. We've also got Maria to thank for these evenings. She brought the idea to South Alive to talk about alternative housing and has been working with the Housing Action Group ever since. So thank you, Maria. It's been really interesting. Now, over to you.
Thank you. Just a quick warning. I've got a slight cold. I have had a COVID test. I do not have COVID. I just have a slight cold that just not go away. But yeah, just get right into it. I grew up on the 9th floor of an apartment building. And when I say this to people in New Zealand, I have a feeling that what they imagine in their heads is this: a concrete jungle a bit like New York. I've had a person say to me, "Oh, that must have been hard for you." One person I was speaking to, when I said that I grew up in an apartment, they immediately started telling me about the importance of green spaces in children's development. And it actually took me a couple of moments to figure out, how do we swap topics mid-conversation? And it's only when I realized that because that person imagined an environment like this, then they immediately thought that I did not have access to green spaces as a child. But in Northern Europe, apartments look more like this. Most of them, if not all of them, some of them, if not most of them, are surrounded by green spaces. And when I talk about Northern Europe, I mostly talk about these 4 countries: Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Estonia. I've lived in 3 of them, I've traveled in all of them, and although they're slightly different the way countries are, I think they have a very similar approach to the use of urban space. These photos are just off of internet, just kind of to show the average working class neighborhood. Something that most kids could look at and say, yeah, I've either lived in one, or I've been in one. I grew up in a town named Kohtla-Järve, which is one of the most deprived regions in Estonia. Behind that big letter R over there, I can probably just about make out the window where my bedroom used to be. When I went to school in the morning, I would go through the yards in between the buildings, and I crossed very few roads. In the afternoon when I came home, I would drop off my bag, change my clothes, have some food, and then I'd disappear for the afternoon. Because even though me and most of my friends grew up in apartments, it didn't mean that we were somehow confined to 4 walls. Like, if anything, it actually meant that we had access to a lot of space, because all the space between the buildings is public. And one of my favorite things as a child is just off to the side of that photo, which is basically a wasteland. I think someone started building an apartment building in the 80s and then decided, no, they didn't want to do it after all. So you had these big piles of rocks, you had these big holes where I think the foundations were meant to be. And over the years, it's grown over with trees and grass. And in spring, when the snow melted, these holes would fill up with water, which to a 10-year-old is awesome, because you go there, you get dirty, you fall in, and then you spend the afternoon in your friend's place while her grandmother washes all your clothes and dries them with an iron, because we're trying to hide from your mum the fact that you fell in. So what I've done, I've taken a screenshot of a satellite image. We've got Invercargill on the left and Kohtla-Järve on the right. Flip them sideways just to fit better. And what I've done is I've used the red marker pen and colored the areas that I consider truly public red. And the ones that are kind of semi-public, like school playgrounds, sports fields, I've colored them yellow, just to kind of talk about the fundamental difference. So in Invercargill, you see how we've got, quite a bit of public space, but we've got it really, it's very limited in terms of, this is your public space, and then once you leave Queen's Park or the Otakara Park or the Otapuni, it's mostly private. If you look at Kohtla-Järve on the side, it's the opposite. There's almost nothing which is private, and all the space, most of it is shared. But the important thing to remember is that New Zealand and Estonia have a very different history. These are total population charts that I got off of. So top is from Stats New Zealand. Bottom one is Stats Estonia. And you'll see how New Zealand has kind of been steadily growing at a pretty, level pace for about 100 years. If you look at Estonian one in the bottom, it looks a bit different, because you've got a bit of growth happening, and then this here is the First World War, and then again a bit of growth happening, and then you've got the Second World War. When the Second World War was happening, the front line moved across Estonia several times. You had the Russian occupation, you had the German occupation, then you had the Russian occupation again. You had bombings, You had people being enlisted into armies of whoever was occupying at the time. And then when the Second World War ended and the world kind of decided that Soviet Union could just keep Estonia, what the Soviet Union did, it started a mass migration program. And this is what this is. So in about 50 years, the population almost doubled. Because people from all over the Soviet Union were being sent to Estonia. And this is my family history and a lot of my friends. Most of us grew up in families that were either bilingual or at least semi-bilingual. My granddad's Estonian, my grandmother's from Russia, my other grandparents are from Ukraine. It's a real mixture. But when you look at the top, that photo there is a Soviet-type apartment development. You kind of have to keep in the back of your head historical context of what was pushing it. Because it's basically Soviet Union saying, we have a lot of people who need houses at the same time. How do we provide the homes? Oh, let's put up apartments. That's a way to do it quickly. And this is what a Soviet apartment development looked like. But having said that, other Nordic countries, so this is me just filming myself using Google Maps. Other Nordic countries did not have Soviet occupation, but nevertheless, their urban space looks very similar. So if you, basically I suggest that you do this at home one day when you've got time, just go on Google Maps, land yourself in neighborhoods and just look around what it looks like. So if you look around, so this is in Finland, in Helsinki, which is the capital city. People tend to live in apartments. The size differs, so here we're looking at smaller, old, probably looking at the, maybe 1930s. If you go, choose another street, it might be something that looks much more modern. 2 stories, 3 stories, 4 stories, up to, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9 stories. And this is very similar all around Northern Europe, that in the city centre where you've got the central business district, it does look a bit like a concrete jungle, but then once you start moving out a little bit, this is what it looks like. So if you're a kid from an apartment block there, and when you step outside, all this space is yours. Did the same thing, I just took out Sweden, so Stockholm, which is the capital of Sweden. Again, open up Google Maps, turn on Street View, and then just start landing on streets to see what it looks like. And again, scale differs, but the general look is kind of very similar. There's a distinct lack of fences, because it's simply how people are used to doing it. I think the next one is one of my favorite ones. I think I landed in someone's backyard. Yeah. So yeah, I can totally imagine being a kid from this apartment block, and when I step out, I've got lots of places to go to. This is a development happening in Estonia right now. Some of these buildings have been built, others are being developed, being put up at the moment. And this is kind of what the space looks like. So you've got apartment buildings, and then all the space around them is shared, which means that if you're a kid from an apartment on the side, when you step outside, you can play at that playground, or that one, or that one. And maybe you don't even live in this neighborhood at all. Maybe you live in a house that's further up the street. And you can wander in and kind of use the space, because you have to share it with others. So it's not just yours, there might be someone else already at the playground, but you actually have access to quite a lot of space. I keep using this word, space, space, space. And if you compare it to Invercargill, what I did here, I went, Invercargill City Council has this widget called City Maps. And one of the things you can do is you look into old satellite and aerial images of what it looked like many years ago. So this, I just landed on Mary Street, 1946. So we've got our houses, we've got our fences, our yards, and you can see how everyone's backyard looks like there's stuff growing there. It's a bit better to see in the next photo because it's better definition. But it looks like it's neat rows of plants. And I think it's vegetable gardens. So 1962, what Mary Street and Jackson Street, what it looks like to me is that you've got the houses, you've got a bit of lawn around the house, and then backyard is your veggie garden. And then if you look through a couple more, what happens in 1974, people still have their veggie gardens. Kind of go backwards and forwards between them. You'll see how land is starting to get developed. Instead of one house, there might be 3 roofs. You know, instead of a smaller roof, you get more roofs. You still have veggie gardens. 1996. Kind of go back between 74, 96, 74, 96. So we're building more on the same space until we get to the latest one, which is 2016, which is kind of what it looks like now. Now I would like to suggest this idea here that functionally it's not that different from this. Because in my house, when I step outside of my house, it's lawn. And for most other people, it's also lawn. Someone living in Tallinn in an apartment, when they step out of the building, it's lawn. It's not the same because the lawn is not yours, and you can't paint your house an outrageous blue color just because you felt like it. You actually have to go and have an agreement with your neighbors first. What are we going to paint the apartment building? It also means that you can use the space and you don't have to mow it. Someone else does it for you. I did a bit more Googling just to see what other apartment developments are happening, kind of as we speak in Estonia. And again, the same pattern emerges. Depending on how close it is to the city, depending on how much space you've got around it, it differs. You might have a quite, wide area, but you might have quite a small area, but it's still distinct lack of fencing and kind of marcation of where someone's land is. The one in the bottom right, I think is hilarious because it's near the coast of the sea. So the developers called it Meremaa, which means sea land. And then I think someone in their marketing department thought that they're being hilarious and they called it New Sea Land. Uus Meremaa. Which means if you go to their English website, this is what you see. Choose a home in New Zealand. And I was thinking that you could be sitting on the internet talking to someone, maybe you're playing a computer game, and you'd be like, oh, where are you from? And they'd be like, oh, I'm from New Zealand. And then you're sitting there thinking that you're talking to someone from a Pacific nation, but actually it's someone kind of sitting in their undies in a lounge near the coast of Estonia. And of course, not all apartment buildings will have space around them because the closer you get to the central business district, the more built up it is. So these are all apartment buildings, well, actually mixed-use developments. This at the top here used to be an old industrial area, but it's very close to the city center, between the city center and the port. And over the years, as the industry moved out, because it doesn't make sense to have heavy industry in the city center, this got developed. So this old building here used to be a salt store, and I think they've turned it into shops. And now all these other buildings popped up. So you've got shops, you've got offices, but you also have residential apartments. The one on the top right, just a few blocks away from there, is actually very similar to Christchurch. They wanted to build a big rectangular conference center, swimming pool, and the city planner said, no, you can't put a big block in the city center. Like if you want to build something that big and that rectangular, you have to move away. So this is what they came up with instead. So again, you've got commercial and shops towards the bottom, and higher levels have apartments. And the one in the bottom right is an old paper mill. One of my favorite ones in Tallinn. It's in the bottom again, commercial, and apartments up top. So you kind of make use of the space you've got, and it doesn't mean that everyone develops like this, because you do have pockets of old neighborhoods that are existing that are fenced off, they remain like that. So these are two biggest cities in Estonia, Tartu and Tallinn. Within 15-minute walk of city center, you have these pockets. So for this one here, the parliament is here. It's literally like the center of the country. And then 15-minute walk, you've got this old neighborhood, probably 1920s, 1930s timber frame. It's still an apartment building because there'll be between 4 and 8 families in each of these, but what they have is they have a fenced off yard that they share. My grandmother used to live in a house like this where when you go in the backyard, everyone kind of knew where their plot was, where they did veggies. And then in the middle, they had a bit of lawn, so if you wanted to have a barbecue, this is what everyone was using. And this here is one of the modern developments happening in a neighborhood like that. So these houses here, some of these are original old houses that have been renovated. And what they've done is, because not all of them were in good condition, some of them have actually been built new, but they've done them all in the same general shape. Like you can still, when you're walking around, you'll be able to tell that one house is 2 years old and the other one is 100. They use different claddings, but essentially they've tried to retain the same use of space. But what they've done is, historically, each of these houses would have had a fence around it and you would have had like a quite small yard. And what they've done now, they've got rid of these fences in the middle and they've grouped them. You've got a fence line running around the group of buildings. Now you've got 8 apartment buildings here, 10 ones here, so they still share the yard, but just on a much bigger scale. And to the side of it, they've put new apartment buildings up in a way that's a little bit unusual in Estonia because they've put them around the perimeter, so you end up with the central kind of a courtyard. It's not gated. So if you're walking down the street, you could turn into that courtyard and use the playground there. But you'll probably have this feeling that it's not really yours, you're not invited there, because just by the way it's set up, you kind of know that it's really meant for the people that are living in the apartments around there. And this is where I think New Zealand and Estonia are meeting. This is a high street co-housing development in Dunedin. It's just been finished. I think the people moved in a couple of weeks ago. And what they've done, they've got terraced housing around the edge, and then in the middle, they've got the shared space, which is pretty much the same model that the one at the top, the Estonian one, is using. It's almost like when Estonia takes a step back from the public space to go a little bit more towards private, and New Zealand steps up towards public space. It's kind of that spot where they meet. There's another one I looked up in Auckland, Mount Roskill, I think it's called Earth Zone. Again, the same idea, you've got co-housing, so each of the people that lives there, they've decided to have less space that's personally theirs, but in exchange to that, they get access to more space that they can use alongside other people. And there's probably more of them in New Zealand, I'm just not that aware of them. But at the end of the day, you just make the best with what you've got. This is an apartment in Estonia, and it's surrounded by a neighborhood where most houses are single home dwellings. It's hard to tell from the photo because the trees are so mature that you can't tell that this house is at all. But if you just take me by my word, if you go walking on these streets, it's kind of similar to how New Zealand is, that where you have fences and people have their yards and then they have their house in the middle of that yard. When they developed this apartment, so the front one is an old historic, probably 1930s Art Deco. So what they've done, they've added another one behind it, kind of mimicking the shape a bit. And because they're surrounded by a neighborhood where most of it is kind of fenced and private anyway, what they've done is behind it, they've also done a courtyard, which they've also fenced. Because I guess they just decided that it didn't make sense to have a fully public space if the neighborhood around you is not really like that. So it's by the way, just a random question. Can anyone tell me what's the big triangular thing in the back?
Ski jump? Well done.
Ski jump, yes, it's a ski jumping tower.
Naturally.
I mean, this is what they look like in summer, but in winter time you actually get people going up there and they jump off the skis and they fly to see who can fly the furthest. Apartments are smaller, generally speaking. In Invercargill, I live in a 1920s bungalow, which is 130 square meters, which by New Zealand standards is quite modest. If I lived in an apartment in Estonia that was 130 square meters, people would be like, oh my God, you've got so much space. So here, again, I just looked up, what are we looking at the moment? So 3 bedrooms in the bottom, less than 100 square meters, 2 bedrooms, 60 square meters. But when you see this, remember that pretty much almost every apartment comes with a storage space in the basement or the ground floor. Because if someone looks at it, they might kind of go, oh, where am I going to put my bike and my snowboarding gear? And the answer is, well, we don't bring them in the apartment because if you live on the 5th floor, you don't want to lug them up the staircase or the lift. So most apartments will have basement units where you've got, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 meters, which basically put your big stuff kind of like we have garages in Invercargill. And this is my cue to stop talking. Last thoughts. This is Queenstown. And why I want to finish with Queenstown is that I think it very much depends the view you have on a place of the experience you had when you first went there. I like Queenstown. My husband doesn't. And there's many reasons for that, but I think one of those reasons is that we had a very different experience when we lived there. I was there in 2009 as a backpacker. I was 2 blocks away from the waterfront, worked a little bit in the morning, and in the afternoons I would just hang out, jump off a wharf, do stuff. When my husband lived in Queenstown, he was there in 2010. He lived in a windowless room in Frankton, and he used to dread being stuck in traffic on Frankton Road as he was trying to get to construction sites. And I think even though now, Queenstown has positives and negatives, but even now when we go to Queenstown, I have this feeling of, oh, Queenstown. And my husband's like, oh, Queenstown. But at the end of the day, when someone talks about apartment development, I think it's less about what's inside the apartment than it is what's outside. Because inside a house can look very similar to what an apartment looks like. It's just your walls and what you do with the interior space. It only makes a difference to what happens when you step outside. So you could move to this neighborhood and have an awesome time. You could have morning sun coming through your bedroom windows, you have lovely neighbors you get along with, you have a lovely playground. But you could also move in there and have neighbors whose kids practice violin at 4 o'clock every afternoon. And one day you can find a cockroach in your kitchen, because turns out the neighbor a couple of stories down has developed a bit of a pest problem, which is a true story and it's horrible when it happens. But basically it's not all positive. It kind of depends on what happens, where you go, what people you live with, and what is outside of the apartment. And this is the point where I think I'm going to finish up. I might leave the questions after Roger's presentation, actually, because I'm really excited about Roger's presentation, because I had a sneak peek on what he's got in mind. And
thanks, Maria. Okay, we're very fortunate to have our next speaker. The name Roger Beattie, maybe Roger Beattie, sorry, no yes. May be familiar to some of you. He's travelled and studied overseas before settling in Auckland, where he established a successful business. He returned to Invercargill in 2010, taking over as practice director and registered architect of Beattie McDowell Architects. He's quickly gained a positive reputation in Invercargill circles. So he didn't pay me to say that. So welcome, Roger.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you very much for all coming along tonight. I'm not a natural public speaker, so I will try not to preach or rant. So anyway, this is a subject that's very I passionately believe in housing diversity and high amenity housing. First of all, I'll touch a bit on the history of how we got to where we are in New Zealand with a predominant suburban form and the quarter-acre pavlova paradise. New Zealand was, when it was originally settled from Europe, very much the ideas that came over were in the early development of the cities was to do with the garden city, which was a development form that came from Europe, which was really a reaction to the density of cities post the Industrial Revolution. And so the garden city form was really about creating better worker housing. It was all about creating space, letting light and air into housing, etc. It was very much a predominant pattern of development that influenced what I'd call the New World, which is sort of Canada, the States, Australia, New Zealand. So, and then those suburban influences then went actually back and influenced quite a bit of Western Europe as well. And so some of those older medieval cities actually got these large suburban forms around them. The suburbs developed. It became all about commuting into the city. It's all about transport, space, etc. They've come to be very dominated by cars and commuting. The predominant form is single detached dwellings and an interesting perception of space as creating, or distance creating amenity and privacy, etc., which is quite different. In some respects, it's quite interesting to see what Maria was talking about with the apartment buildings and all the space around them. But because if you look back at European cities, Southern European or Western European cities, they are very much about continuity and walls and closeness, where in some respects I can see the suburb has got similarities to Northern European cities and the development patterns there. And also, suburbia has fitted down well with the growth of the nuclear family and the movement away from extended families, etc. And there's a whole lot of social phenomena around that. So I'll just try to remove. So then, of course, this is Invercargill, an aerial view of our suburban Invercargill. Then the development of suburbs over time, it became all about land availability. It became about, and it's especially noticeable in some of the large cities in the States, the sprawl, or we talk about suburban sprawl. Some of the issues around suburbia are obviously the infrastructure costs of actually having a large spread out city, as in I think Invercargill has a population density of about 800 people per square kilometre. If you look at Auckland, it's about 2,400 people per square kilometre, and Sydney and Melbourne are similar densities. And I think Melbourne is the 955th least dense city of its size in the world. So all these cities that we think of as dense cities like Auckland are actually incredibly low density on global standards. And then Invercargill's basically off the bottom of the scale. So the other thing that, and I think we especially noticed it in Invercargill, in our inner city, when everybody retreats to the suburbs from work or from the inner city, you end up with an urban form with you might say, a social donut effect, where in the weekends or when outside work hours, the centre is actually empty. And so I think that's something we experience in Invercargill. There's no life in the centre once town's closed. And it was very noticeable in Christchurch as well, before the earthquakes. So we've got issues to deal with in our city. We've got issues to deal with in our the sustainability of the suburban form. We've also got to face that cities need to change over time to actually survive and thrive. And we don't know what the city in the future will look like. but we've actually got to embrace the fact that we do need to change. It doesn't need to necessarily mean that it has to threaten the way we live now, but we do have to face the change, the idea that there's of potentially looking at diversification and actually other ways of living, because we're getting a lot with the migration that's coming into New Zealand, with Kiwis coming back from overseas, etc. We're getting different ideas and different influences coming in. There's also internationally a recognised phenomena, and it's interesting how, Maria, you sort of touched on it slightly in a way, where there's, in urban forms or housing forms, there's a phenomenon called the missing middle, where quite often we have single detached homes like our suburban New Zealand, and then very quickly it moves to mid-rise or high-rise city centre apartment buildings, etc. And there seems to be this missing link in the middle, which is sort of the low-rise multi-unit housing or terraced housing or comprehensive developments, etc., that are actually compatible in scale with the single detached house, and actually trying to create that progression up in forms. Of course, Invercargill doesn't have this, but actually all we've got is this. And so I'm not sure if there's any figures about housing typologies in Invercargill about multi-unit housing or etc. But I think anecdotally we all know that it's a very low percentage of our housing is not single detached houses. So then you start looking at housing density types, and so there's from the low density single detached houses coming through to sort of more looking at maybe smaller lots. Then you start looking at medium density housing with 2 to 3 story, possibly terrace type housing. Then you start looking at 3 to 4 story apartment buildings, and then moving on up through the progression. We believe that these forms here aren't really appropriate to Invercargill, but we think there is possibilities looking in those in the type 1, 2 and 3. So then looking at Invercargill once again, so this is all predominantly single detached dwellings all around here. We've got some smaller lots and some infill happening. A lot of the infill that's happening we don't believe is particularly high amenity, as in we're taking off you might call a standard house off a site and then putting maybe 3 standard houses on, and those sites tend to get dominated by driveways. You're looking into the neighbour's toilet window in front of you. Only one house gets a connection with the street, and the built urban form is on not particularly high amenity. One of the really important things with an urban form is to actually have a connection with the street, and so if you have an urban form where you've got 2 houses out of 3 not connected to the street, there's some undesirable things about that. So one of the interesting things, just talking about density again, like it's interesting to note from just some of the statistics here about the average occupant density of a dwelling in Invercargill is 2.3 people, and 65% of our households are 2 people or less, which is quite a surprising figure, and this is quite surprising how high this is. This is all from Stratford census data. Yet we've actually got 75% of our dwellings are actually 3 bedrooms or more. So we've actually got an awful lot of empty bedrooms, which leads you to the idea that we're actually living in a lot larger houses than we actually need. But I suspect a part of that may be because there's not really a lot of alternatives out there available to 3 bedroom or 4 bedroom family dwellings. And also, of course, that shows that the tenure of housing is changing as well, where ownership is dropping. So there's another thing, just getting back to the whole change thing as well. And in reality, cities are actually competing with each other for people. So Invercargill needs to become an attractive place that people want to come to, and we need to accept change, as in not everybody wants to live the way that we're all used to living, and to get people to come here and want to come to Invercargill, we need to be seen as an attractive place to be, which is not necessarily delivering a single housing type. And the other issue is the other option we can do is we can resist change, but then if we resist change, we'll eventually wither and die as a city. So I think it's very important that we do actually take that on board. Then there's also some interesting influences to change, such as the trend to smaller housing units. People tend to be more mobile in their housing, where once upon a time, maybe back in the 40s or 50s, you probably left home, got married, bought a house, raised your children in that house, and you probably even lived out your retirement years in that house and possibly even died in the house. And that was quite common. Yet these days, I think people are a lot more mobile, and if you're thinking about phases of your life, such as leaving home, maybe getting into a relationship, starting a young family, you actually have different housing needs throughout that period when you have a family, possibly empty nesters, retirement, ambulant, elderly people, etc. So I think we don't actually, not very good at recognising that those needs change over time. So some of the other influences to change are to reduce the dependence on cars. We're experiencing changes in workplace patterns, etc., and with working from home, flexible working arrangements, etc. I've touched on other people, new people coming into Invercargill with new ideas, ways of thinking, ways of being, and also Kiwis returning from overseas who have had different experiences and different understandings and lived in different ways. And it's also interesting with being a lot more mobile is that I think some of those local communities are actually dissolving to many extents as well. And probably that's come out of social changes from the 1940s and 50s onwards as well. So I think there's an argument for change and having some diversity, as in we're all used to what we know, but I think in order to thrive and attract people, we need to actually try and understand what other people might want, and that there might be other ways of living, etc. So the question I'll put down here from the start, so how do these factors influence on how we will dwell in the city? And I think one of the things that we believe is that because we have that same predominant single dwelling type, that we need to offer other types. And if we're looking at the idea of moving on to having some more density in our dwelling, there's some target areas which the Invercargill District Plan actually reflects, which is really heartening. And so there's obviously an area here in South City which is probably one of the more, dare I say, run down parts of the city, or not as maybe as well cared for by the city itself. And so there's an opportunity here to actually for urban regeneration in those areas. At the moment, to create new housing, we've got a housing shortage. To create new housing, we actually are continuing that suburban sprawl building out to the north. And there is a place for that type of development, but we also need to have a place for another type of development which actually looks at a more diverse form, a dense form. And then it's really interesting just looking at something like this. This is just, we went to the Invercargill City Plan and just looked at a typical city block. Just so the white is actually the buildings, houses and garages, etc. And to actually look at how much space is there available, and also think, so what is that high amenity space? Like, we're at a stage in our life where we have young children, so it's actually great to have a bit of a lawn for the kids to run around, etc. But I think also those photographs you were showing, Maria, of looking at the backyards where everybody used to have a large veggie garden or where quite often people aren't actually using their surroundings in the same way as we may have traditionally used to back 30 or 40 years ago. But there might be other ways of actually looking at developing in those blocks, etc. Like you could potentially have terraced housing on the end of blocks, etc. And you can actually, if you could actually develop in a way that it's not compromising the amenity of the existing single detached dwellings, because there's a place for those. but there's also a place for other forms as well. This is actually a development in Auckland that was built back in the early 1980s or 70s, I think, down on Freeman's Bay. And this is an interesting form where these are all terraced house forms. I think they're a mixture of 2 and 3 bedroom houses, and they're actually based around courtyards with a shared park space in the middle. And once again, a bit like you were saying, Maria, it's almost the inverse of what you were talking about in Estonia, where the park's in the middle, and a member of the public can actually walk through that space. And again, but it's a bit ambivalent because it doesn't feel like it's fully public, but it's not fully private as well. But what's really interesting is, I can't remember the exact figures, but from people who originally shifted into these developments when they were new, that there's been a really low turnover, which tends to mean that people are enjoying living there. And so there's then, oh sorry, I've jumped on to something else here. So this is just starting to talk about, so if you're looking at those more dense forms, the urban design and the integration within the urban fabric and the quality of the amenity becomes extremely important, as in it's not just plonking houses on sites, etc. So you're looking at all these things like zoning of public through to private, semi-public, etc. You're looking at interfaces with the street, etc. And then this is just, we've actually done some work in the office just looking at what potential forms, what potential development types of developments could you create. And that's just a 2-storey, 2-bedroom townhouse. It's just a 3-bedroom family home, which once again, that's a terrace house. But this is actually looking at a typical Invercargill 50 metre by 20 metre suburban lot, and just saying, well, what could you potentially to do with these lots to actually get more amenity out of the land area. And I actually lived in this house, in this one here in Auckland. My wife and I lived in it. We didn't have children at that stage, and it was actually great for us because we weren't spending, we wanted some outside space, but we didn't want to have to spend all weekend mowing a lawn or digging a garden or whatever. And so this was close to the cafes and shops, etc. So for us at that stage, that was a great place to live. But we don't actually have the equivalent of that in Invercargill. And then once again, just thinking about, again, this example of how important the linkages within and actually analysing the site and looking at things like proprietorial overlooking of the streets, which increases street safety, etc. It goes, and then how you have private outdoor spaces and you have these public zones, semi-public, private zones, etc., which are all just good urban design principles. And then this is really just looking at some potential about, these are actually at Hobsonville Point in Auckland, and just looking at what some of these forms could actually look like. And so it is very much, and then that's a more low-rise apartment building. And so I think there's opportunities that we could actually introduce some of these forms in Invercargill to give a different potential way of being. And then this is just looking at this potential for actually development in the inner city as well. And then this was just a project we were looking at for Habitat for Humanity down at Kew Bowl, which was actually looking at more of a comprehensive housing development where you have a mixture of single-storey housing in here, which might be, say, more suitable for older people, etc. Then looking at a mix of potentially 3-bedroom family terraced homes here, then some 2-bedroom, 2-storey homes. So once again, looking at trying to create an amount of diversity in that site, and looking at this site it's very important that it becomes a through site, so it becomes integrated with the community. It's not a cul-de-sac, etc. And then just some of those forms of what they could potentially look like, and then of course you would have some diversity in the housing topology. We've just drawn them all the same, so we don't have to go through and choose colour schemes for them all. But then there's an interesting example in Christchurch of a medium density housing typology that actually fits, or we believe actually fits with that suburban environment and form. And so we believe it's an opportunity that could be created in Invercargill, and it just would actually help create that diversity. So we're actually catering to the needs of a greater number of people. And I think that's the end of my presentation. So
Well done.
I'm not sure if I'm on time or not, and thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Now, questions of Roger and Maria.
Could you show, please, you had about 10 or 15 slides back, that city centre development. Is that for Invercargill city centre?
That was something we looked at in Invercargill city centre as an idea.
So if you go back one slide.
I might not.
Yeah, might not? Okay.
Yeah, but like that. Once again, it's about creating spaces. It's about creating linkways through the city, etc. So it's actually it's saying, okay, this is a space for housing, but you actually design it in such a way that it actually creates something more for the city. So it actually, yeah.
Just one query, and that is that what's puzzled me, because we bought our house in 2004, and it's in Yarra Street, very close to the centre of the city.
Mm-hmm.
It was zoned high density residential,
Yeah.
and there's a number of high density properties around it.
Right next door to
Right,
us.
yeah. But when we bought it, that was the zoning, and then without consultation, the council a few years later changed it to 40% coverage. Now, when we bought it, we actually had something in mind because the section's 1,100 squares, and we had thought of a semi-detached building 2 on the back, but similar to some of those other properties. Mm-hmm. And when I actually went and inquired, I found, oh, no, we changed the rules, and now it's 40%. And so all we can do is build a separate
I think maybe that's
house.
more a question for
No, but I'm just saying that,
Yeah.
you know, it seems to me that the council here has gone in exactly the opposite direction to the sort of trends. It actually makes sense to have a semi-detached on the back of that section, so that 3 families can live in that area, which is 5 minutes walk to the centre of town, rather than saying, no, you can only build 1 house. You can have just 2 houses on the back, despite the fact that other properties are 95% covered. So there's actually been, the council has got rules in place that actually actively discriminate against that sort of development.
It's interesting because it comes down to the zoning that your property's in, because there is a zoning, the residential 1A zone, that the density rules drop away. And it's...
But they went the opposite way, because that was the zoning when we bought.
Right.
And
now
now it's 40%.
Right.
So however, you know, and we're 5 minutes walk to the centre of town.
Personally, I think all the residential property that wraps around town would ideally be residential 1A, that actually allows higher density residential.
Yeah, but that's the curious thing from my perspective, is that you went the other way. It was residential 1A, and then they changed it. Oh no, you can have 40% cover.
Okay, you might like to talk to somebody else about that.
Yeah, sorry, but I just raised that.
It's for both the presenters. It seems that in Capital City's going to metamorphise, it's going to go through a process of change because of all these good things that are there, potentially there to use. And I'm curious as to what type of timescale you expect that to happen over. It's going to obviously, if it catches on, it's going to be bees knees. Lots of people going to do it. Is it going to be a decade or 2 decades or 50 years?
Hopefully it's going to be continuous, because I think we've actually are coming to a period of resistance to change. I hope we're coming to the end of that. And I think we've come through an era of stagnation where we've actually resisted change, and I think we actually need to accept that things do need to change. But it doesn't need to be wholesale. Change should be a gradual and managed process. But I'm hoping that it will continue and we will never stop changing, because that's the way we will thrive as a city.
Okay,
Could
yes.
I try and answer this one?
Oh, okay.
Could I try and answer this one?
Yeah, thank you.
I was thinking, because when I was showing some of the photos of the existing old neighbourhoods that are in close proximity to the city centre, I was thinking how, because if you've got a neighbourhood, you know, that's there, and the houses are decent, you're not going to go demolish them to build something else. So this infill that's happening, kind of like I was showing photos of the city centre, that whenever there's something that moves away and you have a chance to do something else, that's kind of what prompts these changes. Whereas here, some of these neighbourhoods, they'll probably be there for quite a long time, because it's not until either the house gets really, in a really bad condition, or it becomes really unfit for, where it sits, and maybe land becomes so expensive that they want to demolish it. But I think for Invercargill, it's probably that whenever something, basically land opens up, and then for someone to put their hand up and say, oh, this is what I want to do, and actually how important it is to then do it, because if you let it go, again, the house is going to be there for, 50, 60, 70 years.
And there's another interesting thing about the suburban sprawl and the extending of the city limits as well, is that you're actually creating more infrastructure that in the end we all end up paying for as ratepayers, because it becomes vested in the city. We're building more roads, we're building more sewage, power wires, etc. And yet we've still got these areas in town that we've got all those services there anyway, and there may need to be some upgrading done on them. But there's actually, I believe that we should be targeting these areas of regeneration. And the Invercargill City District Plan is actually helping try to promote regeneration in these areas. Because for some of the existing residents, they may not be that happy about that, but that's where we believe it's important that we actually, any ideas like development needs to look at the context, and so we need to do it in a way that we don't actually destroy what's there that people want to keep there. And that's where urban design and urban design principles are very important, that it just doesn't become open slather. Yeah.
Yes.
I have 3 questions to ask regarding this type of housing. One, we're used to having the sun come around our buildings and coming in windows. I didn't seem to see a lot of skylights on the top of those buildings, and then the people so many floors down, how are they going to get extra light into their building spaces when they might be used to it? That was my first, because that's something I really enjoy having. The next is, what about the sound between apartments? Has this really come up, the technology on this, so you can't see? And the next is, what about the safety of your children out in these areas with other children, whereas a mother can lead her child or children into the backyard? So they're things that just come up into my mind when I'm looking at. I like the idea of it, but it's just things I would need to find more out of it.
And they're all really good questions and really good things that need to be addressed in this typology. It's interesting what you're saying about the sun, because or light and solar. I'm assuming that solar gain is, because in some respects sun is about light. It's about solar gain. It's the psychological ability to sit in the sun or see something sunny, etc. as well. Because in some respects, we've all grown up in houses that weren't very well insulated, that were drafty, and the heat just zipped out of them. Under the New Zealand Building Code at the moment, which internationally is actually quite a low standard, but the houses are airtight, they're insulated, and those requirements are going to change. There's new requirements coming in that are probably going to lift the required levels of insulation, etc. So when we're thinking about solar gain and the need to get all-day sun, most people in Invercargill think I'm balmy when I say this, is we actually need to start getting concerned about overheating in our houses through excess solar gain. And I've actually experienced that ourselves when we shifted back home, and we rented a house out on the outskirts of Invercargill, and it was built to building code minimums, and we would find, like a day like today in winter, we actually had to open the windows because the house was overheating just because there was so much window facing north. And so then it becomes important. So I think the solar gain thing isn't as important as we're used to thinking it is, because we live in much better insulated homes. So then it becomes about the ability, the psychological side, about being able to see a sunny space or to be able to sit in the sun. And so, but then that might not necessarily mean a need for all day sun. It might be that you have sun coming in through one side in the morning and another side in the afternoon, because not every house can realistically be built to face north, and it doesn't happen at the moment either. And then the other side, you were talking about the children and the safety, etc. In some respects, good urban design principles would encourage the street to be overlooked as well. So in some respects, you actually get a degree of safety through that. So people become connected with the street, where we've gone through a phase of all building big high fences to shut ourselves off from the street. And personally, that leads to the street just becoming a corridor for cars. And so not a particularly safe space. So we're actually encouraging houses to actually look back to the street, connect to the street. I think that's a really positive thing for safety too.
Sorry, can I just add to what she's saying? I'm assuming we talked about the fact that people in New Zealand in the 40s and 50s, we didn't move from neighbourhoods. I'm a farm kid from way back, so we didn't move either. But I'm assuming that what you were talking about with what children needed in your childhood was people didn't move much there either. I'm assuming once you settled in an apartment, so you grew up with the neighbourhood kids, so everybody was practically aunties and uncles, I'm guessing.
Oh, they'd have their own way of looking after each other.
I guess you get that sense of when everybody's looking, nobody's looking, and that's why, kids in swimming pools become scary, but when there's a whole crowd of people. So I'm assuming there's still that danger which is going to be present everywhere. But if these places are nice to stay in, I'm assuming that must help.
I remember when me and Roger met a couple of weeks back, we had a quick brief of what we're going to talk about. Roger told me a story that he had one of his colleagues that was from southern Europe somewhere, where they tend to build houses so that you've got this inner courtyard, and he was saying how the kids would be playing there, and they're saying that when you hear someone crying, a whole bunch of windows opens up, because there's whose kid is that? So it's almost like a babysitting service.
So the kid would cry, and the other kids would look up, and all the mums would be looking at, is it mine? But there was a safety and a community thing about that, and an interaction. But one of the key things that density does create, and if it's following good urban design principles, and you're actually connecting with the street, etc., you're actually getting more people in an area. So all of a sudden, you can find that there's actually enough people to actually make the corner dairy financially viable. So then people walk down the street to the corner dairy, they say hello to their neighbour, they'll stop them at the cafe. And so then you actually start getting a vibrancy on the street, and that's what we're really missing from inner city Invercargill. So the idea of actually creating medium density housing on the outskirts of the city centre, I think, would go a long way towards actually helping increase vibrancy in the city as well. Because you'll get people walking in to get a coffee, whatever, walking to work. And so the way to get vibrancy in the city is to get people out of cars. Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I've lived in apartments before as well, and they do provide a sense of security, they provide a sense of community. My question is really around how they're great when they're working well, not so great when they're not. So I don't know, say for instance, normally they have body court fees.
I think we'll leave
I'm totally top of that.
Liz Henry's going to be talking about that area.
Yeah, and also just even it doesn't take much for it to go a little bit haywire sometimes. And how do you protect in that space? Because bring on the apartments, bring them in, I'm looking forward to that. But,
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Roger. And if you're thinking buying a house involves an unfamiliar legal language, then be prepared for a whole new vocabulary when buying an apartment. Our next speaker is Liz Henry from a director of Me and Henry Law, who may unravel the intricacies of unit titles and body corporates within the current and soon-to-be amended law. So welcome, Liz.
It's funny, I always find that when a lawyer stands up in a group like this here, you've got really enthusiastic and excited people who are like, yeah, this is really great. And then you've got the fun sucker. And so I'm kind of tonight's fun sucker in that the realities of medium density housing can actually be really problematic, particularly when it relies on humans, because all of us have our little wee intricacies, isn't it? So I'm constantly on the phone with people talking about problems with their neighbours, and this is when we've got our own, quarter-acre section of paradise with the orchard out the back and the trampoline for the kids and a lot of space, and they're still complaining about the fact their neighbours' trees are overhanging the fence by 30 centimetres, and they couldn't possibly trim it and throw it over the fence. They'd much rather smash the fence down and take the tree with it. So when we deal with humans, we constantly have problems. So there's a lot of awesome stuff about apartments. I love it. The apartments are a lot of fun, but it does take a mindset change as an owner of an apartment. So in New Zealand, we kind of work on this gold standard of the single dwelling, like on a quarter-acre section, right? And it's like, oh, we love it. The fee simple freehold estate is like, we rate that as the best version of land you can buy. So, and in fact, if you buy a piece of freehold estate, it actually puts you in the wealthiest 8% of the population of the world. My bank owns most of mine, but I still fancy myself in that section. So, that's amazing. And obviously, when you change the nature of how you own a title, so going from a fee simple estate to a cross lease is where you own like a share of the underlying title, but you have the exclusive right to a certain area of it. That's a diminished value. The gold standard is the freehold. Then the cross lease will come underneath it, and then we've got leaseholds, and we've got, but we've got unit titles is what covers the legal rights when we've got multiple units on a property. And our Unit Titles Act was actually significantly reviewed in 2010, which was fantastic for us, because prior to that we'd sort of piecemeal put together some stuff and just sort of went a bit by the fly, as we tend to do in New Zealand more. And it got to the point where a lot of our housing that was created under the earlier 1972 legislation actually was failing, because houses get old and you've actually got to do maintenance on them. What is this about, So, and when you've got an apartment, you've actually got to get all of the owners to agree on maintenance and what needs to be done. And you can go down any street in Invercargill and you'll know the guy who cleans their gutter on a 2-month, or regularly, versus the guy who's never cleaned his gutter since he's owned it. Incidentally, there's a maintenance guide on brands.co.nz, and it tells you how to suck eggs when it comes to your home maintenance. And it used to be given out with your mortgage. So in the 80s, if ANZ was, if you're getting a mortgage with them, they'd say that's fine, but as a criteria of us having a mortgage, you borrow money from us, we want you to do the following maintenance on your house each year. And that's when people knew how to do that. I don't even know what a hammer is, so I'm not sure how to do maintenance. So these are really good guides, because it can tell you how to do stuff. But when it comes to a unit title, and you've got it's a lot more complex, because the guy who's really good at cleaning the gutter on one end of the development versus the guy who never cleans the gutter are going to have a difference of opinion regarding what needs to be done on the property. So in 2010 we decided we needed to fix those problems with the Unit Titles Act, because we had to be able to manage these humans who couldn't actually work out Arthur from Martha when it came to their maintenance plan. So now we have a set of rules that has to apply to every development, okay? And it's going to depend on the nature of the development. Some are going to be very large scale developments, and some are going to be more small scale. And but every one of them has to have a maintenance plan. So as a body corporate, the owners are collectively having to get together and organise a plan. And that can actually be quite expensive, because if you're the person who actually doesn't or can't afford to put in $10,000 to replace the roof this year, but maybe in 2 or 3 years' time they might be able to, then you're going to be less likely to encourage a maintenance plan that puts the new roof on before it starts leaking, if you know what I mean. So, when I'm sucking the joy out of a unit title, I often say to people, right, let's have a look at your average costs. The nature of your building means that you're going to be dragged along, or you could be dragged along with the other owners, to do a bit more work on your property than maybe you can afford. So if a first home buyer was going into an apartment, we would want to make sure they've got either income to service additional costs for the next 5 years. So they know they might need, say, 10,000 extra a year to put towards like a maintenance program for their particular unit. And I'm not talking about wallpapering or bathroom fixtures inside. I'm talking about the external parts. The things that make it weather tight, the things that make it look pretty on the outside, and the common areas outside as well. So, the Queenstown apartment scene's been really interesting. It's also some of our leading case law in relation to how to cock up a apartment complex, a lot of weather tight issues in some of it, and it's ended up costing a lot of owners quite a lot of money. There's just been a recent settlement of some apartments, which have resulted in a lot of people getting less than they purchased, like less than they paid for it back after the properties have been deemed severely damaged. So there's flaws that come with it. But the Unit Titles Act tries to remedy some of those matters. I've got here a short guide to unit titles, what you need to know. It's really good because it's a government document and it's only 11 pages long and it's got pictures. So that's really cool. So it's got a bit of a summary here, and I'll leave it for those who are interested. Just to know about what unit title is, I think the most important thing is acknowledging that your ownership is not in the whole land. It's not in the freehold title. It's not the whole bit. You get the right, an interest in the property for that, your box. Your right that you're going to have the right to use inside it. Plus, usually an accessory unit, like we were talking about with storage, or it could be a garage. Usually they include a car park, although it depends on where you are, because sometimes body corporates sell the car parks to other people to make money, to pay for their maintenance. It's common in Wellington. And so you'll have an entitlement. So let's say there are, because it's medium density, let's say there's 8 houses, 8 sort of separate units on a title, then you'll have a percentage of the land based on that 1/8 share in terms of an entitlement. So that gives you your rights to vote. Now sometimes units are smaller, so you've got your 2-bedroom units and you've got your 3 or 4-bedroom units in the same complex. Your voting rights will change based on how much land you've got, how much use you've got. So actually you can have what looks like to be quite a similar size place, but the neighbour next door actually has greater voting rights and things. So it's an interesting sort of thing. Before you buy, you get what's called pre-contract disclosure. And this is it's a bit like a bikini. It's quite interesting. But it's covering the most vital stuff, right? So this will tell us approximately what your costs are going to be. Give you a chance to recover. It'll tell you approximately what your costs are going to be each year based on what's currently been put in place. So that usually includes a body corporate insurance fee, the approximate maintenance plan that's been agreed on. It'll include rates, and how they're divvied up, and it'll include any information that the body corporate needs to tell you about disputes. And this is where we find out that you've got the neighbour who's really noisy with their bagpipes at 3 o'clock in the morning. Quite like bagpipes, but 3 o'clock in the morning is not time for bagpipes. That's actually a case that's been going on in a body corporate situation where there's a group of musicians who love to get together. and they've actually got a common area, and it's known as the music room. But it's causing a few problems. So, yeah, because we're human and we like to complain about things. So we've got to be really careful when you're looking at a property to make sure it's going to suit your needs for those types of things too. So the pre-contract disclosure is required to be given. Now, in most cases where I get a contract that's a unit title, the pre-contract disclosure is incorrect. It's not provided properly because most body corporates in New Zealand are actually run inappropriately. They're not well governed and they don't have body corporate managers who know what they are doing. So they're not hiring a body corporate secretary because actually they've only got 2 or 3 properties, people on it. So the neighbours just talk to each other. They just, oh no, it's okay, we'll just do it ourselves. We'll take care of our own insurance. Well, body corporates are required to be all insured, so all of the properties are insured. So if one person burns their house down, and because they're living right next door to the other house, kind of flows on, So there's no point this guy having insurance and this guy not, So I want to make sure that's all covered. So that pre-contract disclosure often is wrong. Often we have to go back and ask for additional information or for it to be clarified because they're not being run properly. And so 10 years after the 2010 legislation, the government requested that the legislation be reviewed. So the Unit Titles Act is currently in review, and there's actually been a members' bill also presented by one of the members of the opposition who is asking for better standards regarding governance under unit titles. And this is going to put a bit more emphasis on making sure you're a bit more professional regarding how you're doing your body corporate management and holding those body corporate owners to a greater account. So I think what we're going to see out of that is a higher standard that comes out of it. But we're still going to see those small unit areas failing in understanding their unit title because they're still trying to treat themselves as a standalone unit or just a normal house or a cross lease because it's easier when you've only got 2 or 3 people. So that's something that's going to come in. And I think as a result of that members' bill, if it's at select committee stage at the moment, if that progresses in the way it currently is, what we're going to find is a lot of the units that have been developed in the 90s, I see a lot of them in Central Otago, Dunedin's got quite a few of them and stuff. They're actually probably just going to get themselves into trouble a little bit, so they'll be going through a period of time where they'll get some fines and stuff because they're not managing what they're doing properly. Because it is a different, you're the, as a unit title owner, you're the guardians of the whole development, not just your house. And so it is quite a mindset change. Does that make sense? I'm talking all over the show, so I tend to do that.
So Liz, with the unit title and the body corporate, is there like an elected committee?
Yes.
Depending on your numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there were 3 units, then all property owners would likely be on just be involved. You wouldn't just delegate it to one person. I mean, you could, but you usually wouldn't. As it gets bigger, then you would tend to work. But everyone's got voting rights. So Queenstown's really, it's a good example. We've got a lot of I won't say litigious, but that's what I mean. People who are, you'll have one person in the house and they quite like the fact that there's a guy in Queenstown who's got a sky dish on the outside of this building, which is completely in breach of the body corporate rules because you're not allowed to have additional fixtures on the outside of the building. And they arranged sky and that kind of stuff through a different mechanism to ensure that that wasn't going to happen. And he just likes to stir, so he just goes to all the meetings and they're like, get your dish down. Oh yeah, no, I'm not going to. But they're not going to take him to court over it, are they? Until they do. It cost the body corporate $652,000 in court fees going through a court process to get to take Sky dish down. I was like, and guess who had to pay? Every other owner.
He won't be getting invited to the party.
No, definitely not invited to the Christmas thing, Yeah, so when you're in a body corporate, there's some really good things about it too. You do get to have meetings, they're really exciting, aren't they? And you get to vote in relation to the outside of your unit, common areas, and as long as you've paid your body corporate levy, so you've got to pay a fee each year. So what we've seen, Auckland's really interesting actually. We've got, because a lot of these are really well established and they're usually higher density housing, but we've seen a lot of people who are like, hey, every year I need to have like 20 grand in my pocket to pay my body corporate levy. Like, it's quite significant. And then sometimes those properties, they don't actually own the land underneath. So they're not only paying a body corporate levy, they're also paying a lease for the land. And that lease might be, 600,000 for the whole area, but everyone's got to pay a component of it. Or it could be 6 million for the whole area.
So does the person with more voting rights pay more? So if you've
Yes,
got the full,
yes.
if you've got
Yeah.
the 4-bedroom place next
Yes.
to the 2,
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely. Yeah, so it's sort of like the levy gets based on that, definitely. Yeah. You do get the right to have quiet enjoyment to your unit, which is really cool because it's like you can go and you can be in there and be like nobody else can invade, which is really cool. But you've got to be aware that your unit has usually a shared corridor or shared walls. So depending on the building standard, depends on whether you're going to have the noise and things from neighbours. It's really fascinating at the moment. There's a whole lot of investment strategies you can put money in with. People are. It's kind of. It's like a blue chip type sort of thing where they want you to put money and invest in these apartment blocks, and they're getting you to prepay now, but they're not going to build for another 5 years. But they've got the price all fixed in, and like I look at the building price and I'm like, wow, that's going to go up. But you've got a fixed price for an apartment, and so what's going to be sacrificed? Like when the building prices go up and they can't, the quality. And so the first thing that's going to go is some of the nature of how, they might have gone and said, we're going to have a really thick wall, that's a really good description of the sound wall, right? And then it's going to be diminished or something. There's going to be small things that they're going to give away. And that's what we actually found with the blue chip back in the early 2000s. Insurance, so the body corporate has a shared insurance policy. And, if you breach the insurance policy, like one body corporate owner breaches it by some of the actions that they're doing, and the other members aren't calling them on it, then you can all lose your insurance. I don't like paying insurance, on a good day, but I do like the ability that I can pay insurance and have insurance because then at least if something goes wrong, I can pay out. So it does mean that you kind of have to keep an eye, don't you, on your neighbours. I'm not saying you have to go through the laundry or anything like that, but what I am saying is that you do start to go, well, if you're doing something that's going to prejudice my insurance policy, then I'm going to need to have a word. And then, that's when Funsucker gets involved and we send things on letterhead and people get upset. So things can go wrong, but actually things can go wrong with any type of ownership of a house. Things can go wrong with rentals. So I think when it comes to body corporates, or unit titles, medium density housing, one of the key things that you've got to do is you've got to have the right mindset going into it. So it's similar to, if an elderly lady who was in a wheelchair came and said to me, I'm going to buy a house. It's fantastic. It's buy a house. I like doing houses. And she tells me she's going to buy something that's only got stairwell access and it's a 2-story, it's a second story. I'm going to look at her like, why would you do that? It's not suitable for your needs. And so if you came and said to me, my priorities are having my own space, being able to yell at my kids without my neighbours looking at me, no, don't say that. Then I'm going to say to you, well, maybe the apartment living's not for you. But if you say to me, I just want somewhere I can be, I want to be able to check in and check out, like little cleaning to do, I want to be able to shower, cook, but not necessarily do a banquet for 20 people. I want to be able to, I don't want any lawns to mow on the weekends, I want that to be controlled. Then I'm going to say, well, actually, apartment's actually a really good option for you because, a lot of that's managed. Doesn't mean you don't have to clean, and doesn't mean you don't have to commit to doing other stuff, but it does mean that it's not necessarily, not so time pressured on it. So, and I think in Invercargill we're desperate for housing. I keep keeping an eye on the house prices, and I do a lot of conveyancing, so I tend to have a reasonable handle on it. But there is a real sense of urgency in the market at the moment of people trying to get into their first home, and I'm hearing from some first home buyers that they're told it doesn't matter what house you buy, just buy something, because you need to get on the property ladder. Because if you don't get on the property ladder, you are insert word here, failure, insert word here, always going to rent for the rest of your life, paying somebody else's mortgage. You're never going to have security with where you lay your head life. And I don't think they're the right messages to put out at all. And I think, Germany has a really good way of looking at things with how their housing goes. They've got a very small proportion of their population who are actually homeowners living in their own home, really high proportion of rentals. But they've got a lot of medium and high density living, but they're well maintained. Okay, so in Invercargill we've got huge areas of the cities which you can walk down the street and go, whoa, you certainly do not clean your gutter and you haven't painted your house. When the railway companies stopped painting houses along the railway line, we had an immediate overnight change with how much maintenance was done in Invercargill on this side of town. Because what used to happen was the railway line would give you the bucket of railway paint, or they'd even come and paint it. As long as the houses on the railway line look pretty, just the front side of them, mind you, not the back, because they look good for the passenger trains, then the houses were painted. And then what happened is, because they had painted, the Joneses across the road had to keep up with them, so they would paint. And so it would go back and forth and back and forth. Almost immediately when Muldoon changed the way that the painting was going, we had an overnight change with our maintenance criteria in Invercargill. And we've got a significant number of houses in Invercargill that have serious deferred maintenance issues. And some of them should be best dealt with by being pulled down. But, which would be great for developments in a more real way. And then a lot of the people, there's a lot of people who are keen to do developments, but it comes down to cost. And it comes down to bank funding. So at the moment, if you're looking at doing a development of building one house, it's like, I've got a section on we build a house. It's so much easier to tick the boxes to get across the line, to get bank lending, to get council consent, and to get it underway with the builder. Those who are trying to get bigger developments going, you tend to need someone who's got a fair bit of cash behind them, or a fair bit of financial backing. And that's probably our biggest impediment down here, that we need them to be willing to build quality housing as a medium density way, and go through the process of having to get it across the line, because your average mum and dad or average individual aren't actually going to be in a position to build multiple houses because of the funding hoops you jump through, and the council hoops you jump through. Sorry, Jonathan.
Right.
I've got some handouts if you want it.
Thank you. Right.
Oh, and I've also got some
Yes.
houses. These are like these squeeze and they've got stress balls, because buying a house is really stressful, so we could take you through the process. As stress-free as possible.
That's the
So they're on the table.
They're on the table, you're welcome to grab one.
On the table in the grey box.
That's almost gag worthy, isn't it?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, you can.
If you're going into one of these areas and you're buying one area and you have so many voting rights, can you find out the voting rights of other people in that?
Absolutely, yeah, it's all available, so it's all actually pre-printed and available. And so part of the due diligence that you would get with your lawyer would give you a copy of the title, they'll give you a copy of the rules, the voting allocations, and then they'll be following through for that pre-contract disclosure, making sure you've got that information, and helping you know which questions to ask. It is a more expensive process, buying a unit title, and a lot of people go, wow, lawyers, you're charging through the nose for this. But what you should get out of them should be worth the additional cost associated with purchasing that good. And I say that not because I charge heaps, but my colleagues and other firms do.
Just a query in terms of, you mentioned that with the voting rights, that if you own a bigger unit, that tends to be associated with right, because you're paying a higher fee.
Yeah, I'm not talking huge, so it doesn't tend to tip the balance, okay?
No.
So it tends to, if you've got 5 units,
Oh, okay.
you still will have, there's obviously 5 persons voting, if you get what I mean, but the voting entitlement might be, you've got 500 votes. I'll think of an example in Queenstown, so this 500 votes, and then one person might have 92, and the other person might have 120. So it doesn't tend to throw the scale completely out of whack, and you still have to be you know, where our more bigger units and stuff, you actually become a little more insignificant in some ways and get more dragged along. But those smaller units, you tend to be, you know, it's not as unfair, as uneven as it might sound. It's probably not a very good description of it.
Yeah, well, that was useful. Thank you.
Hey, Noel, do you have a question, or are you just stretching?
I just wanted to say thank you very much for a very well put together presentation. It's very enlightening for me.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, to the presenters and to you.
We're not finished yet. We've
I
got
just want to say
Well
that.
right, so no pressure.
So, if, say, just on the off chance, someone does do that thing with the satellite dish, you know, I know some other ones that are common are about having clotheslines out and things like that.
Oh, yes, don't hang your towel over the balcony.
Yeah, things like that. What are your other options apart from 62,000 at the lawyers?
Yeah, so I actually find opening your mouth and talking to them is really helpful. It's a really simple concept. It usually does more than a letter on a letterhead,
Yes.
right? And so a lot of people fail to miss the opportunity to say, hey, why did you feel you needed that? So understand the interests of that person. Because when it came down to it, the reason he needed it was because the system they put in place failed. And so it actually would have been if they put an extender on the system that they had internally, he wouldn't have needed the thing. But they never asked it. They just said you need to remove it.
But
and
they
they did
never
it
told
aggressively.
them either, I'm guessing.
Yeah, but that's how humans work, right? Where you go, bloody lawyers on a letter, you know, and then they just, you know, you don't look at the obvious. So I often think most disputes are actually quite easily resolvable if you find out what the underlying interest is. Like, why did you actually need to do this? And how can we make it so, like, what's an alternative? And that's it, yeah. Clotheslines are a real, you know, yeah.
Heat pumps are another
I like it, Bupa, you can't hang your knickers outside.
The body corporate fee, so, okay, you buy into an apartment, body corporate's 4.5
This year, yep.
this year. And then, you know, you tip probably out of the thing and suddenly it's 15,000.
Yeah, and it does happen like that. In fact, I saw one jump recently and it went from 4,500 to 27,500. Huge.
Do you get assistance with that?
No. Because you owe your neighbours. And so, but usually it's because you've planned it, or it should be. Because the reason the body corporate figures are there is because you've approved them each year at your meetings, and you've actually done a maintenance plan to say that if you pay this, we'll do this. So that 27,000 actually usually goes into still paying the rates and insurance, but also doing the roof, or painting the outside, or fixing broken decks, or, you know.
And suddenly the swimming pool has a breakdown, and that's not in the maintenance plan.
That's right, yeah.
And you have a special gathering up. Yes.
So could it drop down just the same as it goes up?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So
When
if
you
you've done
don't
all
have
those
to put the swimming
expenditure,
pool and
yeah, you've
stuff.
done all that expenditure, and then it might go back to the 4 or 5, you know, for a while. But you know,
Theoretically.
things do tend to ratchet.
And other question is, what about, like, I know Auckland, for instance, when I was up there, a lot of apartment dwellers, you know, people living in them actually had animals.
It does depend on your rules. So
Yeah,
a lot of them are. There's usually a restriction based on certain dog types not being allowed, and that's simply because certain dog types aren't suited to apartment living. I'm talking like
Sheepdogs.
yeah, and I'm also talking like similar to Rolleston. Actually, Rolleston community has their bylaw restricts a whole number of dogs because their housing density is so tight. They don't actually want like Rottweilers and different things in like a community. And so yeah, so it does depend on the rules, but you know, in general, you're not actually prohibited from what you've got in your own unit. So because you've got the right to quiet enjoyment, unless it's specifically noted on the rules.
Unless it's loud enjoyment.
Yeah, unless it's loud enjoyment. No, being close to the
Okay, moving right along. The final speakers have been sitting quietly throughout the presentations and will comment on ICC planning and compliance issues as they relate, I'm hoping, to apartment living. So please welcome Liz Devery, Team Leader of Planning. She will come first, and she will be followed by Jonathan Shaw.
Really?
It's official now.
It's been announced.
He's just the manager of building and planning. Welcome.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. I'm Liz Devery, so as Margaret said, I'm the team leader of the planning team at the Invercargill City Council. My background goes way back in planning, and I've worked in cities where there have been apartments, and I've spent doing consents, resource consents. In England, for example, we had loads and loads and loads of consents just for people wanting to replace their windows. So because you're in an apartment, everyone had to have the same window. So there were resource consents, planning consents for replacing windows. They were easy, I could get them done real quick, but yeah. So I do have a history in that. I've also got a history in urban regeneration and renewal for community regeneration work as well, in England as well. So this is all great stuff. I've been worked in the Cardiff City Council for longer than I'd like to say. Before I became a team leader, my job was the senior policy planner, and so the district plan was one of my key jobs. So back in 2011, we started a review of the district plan. In 2019, we got a new district plan. And in that process, we changed the zoning rules. We'll talk about that later. And so, in that process, we had a look at what type of activities should go where, what density type of residential activities could go where. The regional council said, look, you've got to provide different housing typologies, different housing options for different people. And so we looked at our city, we looked at our hazard zones, we looked at where planes fly over, and we looked at what the existing housing patterns were at the time. So some people would say, why do you not allow medium density development in Windsor? And we would say because there's been so much infill in Windsor, to get a really good comprehensive medium density development, it's going to be really difficult because you can't do that on a 400 square metre section. You actually need a big chunk. And then we also looked at areas that are close to the city centre, people can walk. Close to South City, people can walk. There's public transport routes. Close to, we're lucky we've got a nice greenway, so there's access to public spaces, public parks, things like that. So those sort of things come into our mind, as well as the conversations we've had here about the opportunities to regenerate an existing neighbourhood with existing infrastructure that has a capacity for growth. And so this is how we zone. So you'll see the grey bit's industrial land. This purple bit here is our city centre, and then the bulk of it is residential. But what you'll see in my next slide, sorry, I'm getting my phone ringing and I should ignore that. Yeah, right. So this is what we call a medium density residential zone. And in that zone, if you've got 2,000 square metres, you can do a medium density development, but you need a resource consent. So we can have a look at things like public space. So where are you going to put your rubbish bins? Have you got room for a bike shed, for car parking, those types of things. And then we also look at urban design. All these, we don't want cookie cutter houses, so all the houses look exactly the same. Try and get some integration, different types of roof lines, sort of bring some interest to the neighbourhood. We look at pedestrian access, safety, all of those types of things, and so that's why we require resource consent. But this is where we would love some more medium density housing. And these bits here. Also, we've got the business zone. So this is the city centre. We've got the South City area here. There's a Windsor. There's other ones sort of around. And in those zones, you can actually do apartments. You don't need any outdoor living space. You don't need anything, pretty much. You can cover your whole site in buildings. And that's to look at inner city apartment type options. And I'll show you a couple soon. In Windsor, we're recently getting to see some more intense development coming in those business zones because we actually permit it. It's fine. So this is Windsor. And this is an application at the moment. I won't talk about the merits of it because it's still no decision's been made yet. But this is in the middle of King Street. There's currently a shop there, and they're looking at putting 5 houses there. There's no outdoor living space for that at all. The front section here is only 80 square metres, so it's quite small, but they were hoping to have some sort of business in there. It's going to look a bit like that. So I've just shown you this because actually people are starting to think about what their options are. Oh, this is just the plan of one that's already been built in Windsor, so it's pretty much directly opposite the Windsor. What's the next one? Again, I won't comment on this one. This one is a medium density development that's currently going through a resource consent process. Got a hearing for it next week because we'd all love to do this on our property. This is in the medium density zone, so ideally it's all okay. But what you're doing on your property affects other people around you. So what we're finding in Auckland, for example, the zones there that they can go up to 7 stories high. In fact, the government says you've got to zone land for 7-story high apartments close to rapid transit routes. So people in existing houses at the moment, they're just living in little single houses, suburban houses, and then they're finding that the 7-story apartments being built next door to them. And they're going, nobody told me this was going to happen, but it's been required, and so there's effects on. We have to have a look at how it integrates with the wider community as well.
So you've got shading.
Yep, those types of things. This is my last slide. I haven't really got anything much more to talk about. I thought maybe it'd be a bit more question time. This is just showing that actually we do have inner city apartments now. Some may not be the best, but there are opportunities within the city centre now for living. We'd love to see more. As Roger said, people living in the town will bring some vibrancy, some safety, and hopefully build our community. But there are opportunities for it. But I'm more than happy to answer questions about the pros and cons of doing that.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries.
I've been through that one.
That's quite nice.
That's currently getting a bit of work done to
Got a
it.
question?
Question.
Oh, yeah. I have lots of questions.
Yeah.
I'm actually a big fan of such kind of living. I'm the student of SAT and live in their apartment. And the first question, the biggest one, especially to you as city council, is about recycling. So if it's small, there are little houses, like 2 owners or something. Probably, I just don't know. I'm not the owner of any house, so I don't know if it's compulsory to have a recycling bin for everybody or not. But what's happening with the big, they actually called condominium, I think, what you told me about it. Condominium in Canada, they are popular in Europe. So in those big apartments, usually they have management, and pretty much often they rent it. So it's very much depends on the management company. If they feel like provide recycling bin, people are happy to have it. If they know, it's like, we don't have it. So do you think it should be compulsory for the management company to provide recycling bin? Because SIT, they have at least 3 from buildings, and it's, I think, approximately 200 people live there, and they don't have access to recycling. No,
None at all.
Zero. And I'm super angry about it.
You're not angry.
Because every second week I should
take
disability. And
Are you taking that
there.
song?
No. It should be forbidden. It should be illegal. The same story was in Hamilton. I actually used to work for the company, for the property management company, and they provide service for buildings renting as well. So probably I shouldn't mention it. But the same story. They didn't want to provide it, and I could hear from people who lived there, like, oh, we don't have recycling, and I was working there, so I could somehow have influence. And I asked my boss and my colleagues, like, why we don't have it? Let's provide. Like, if we would have recycling bin, we could put a smaller bin for the usual rubbish and just like smaller for recycling. Just separate, like pay both. It's not like you pay too much money for two of them, and they just don't care. So it should be illegal. It should be compulsory.
I think she's got that.
No,
Right.
definitely. The waste management team is different to mine. When we would look at a medium density development, we specifically, and people look at us going, what do you care about rubbish bins? It's because everybody needs a rubbish bin, and everyone at the moment should have 2 free bins.
Yeah.
But when you, I guess maybe if you've got 30 odd properties, there may not be a need for 30 separate ones. But usually it's per property, you get 1.
No.
So I'm not too sure with this.
Zero.
That's interesting. I will take that back.
Do they take
to
your
Donna.
rubbish? Do they take your rubbish?
The rubbish yes, but not recycling.
No,
Is
they
it,
don't.
is it,
Nothing.
is
Not
it,
on the campuses, not in the apartments. Zero.
but is it a council supplied service or have they got a private service for rubbish disposal?
Shared management, probably I shouldn't tell about it, but I won't. Because it's not fair. So people don't have access to it. They should spend their own time, their own money or resources to go to the disability recycling center to bring it by themselves. But not everybody would do it. They
Come on,
are
Jonathan,
busy,
man up.
not everybody, and so on. So everybody like decide what to do with it, and not everybody as crazy as I am to bring it by myself. But I mean,
Thank
so
you.
many apartments and zero in the campus as well. So
That's really surprising to all of us. Thank you for raising it with us.
I'll look into it, hence
We
we'll
will.
roll tomorrow.
Straight into
they
the
probably won't get rid of me.
We will not name names.
Don't find a legal one you know.
There's a lawyer over here.
Okay, this one over here.
With your purple spit strip where you can have bigger apartments and stuff, do the landowners and the property owners of those properties know that they have that option? Is that made known to them, or is it the plans just got changed and unless they go looking they wouldn't know?
A lot of them would know though, because the nature of where they're buying. So, if they bought recently, they'd be
More
told.
recently,
this.
yeah.
Recently, but then
Yeah,
But it is a known area for high development. So
we do go out, we have to consult when we make change of district plan, so we actually have to do consultation. There's a whole further submission process. So there is opportunities for people to get involved and find out, but Joe Public doesn't tend to get involved until it actually happens or they actually want to do something.
put Facebook comments up.
They're good at that.
Why is there a big patch of medium density missing just east of the city centre?
Yeah.
So where are you?
So just north of the swimming pool, basically. Just go east.
Oh, that's where Harvey Norman and
On here, this is
Yeah, just north of there. Why
Right.
is there a patch not medium density?
like the gate.
It looks like there should be a pink area just right of there. Your ready pink area. It looks like you should have far more of it.
Oh, on this side of it.
Yeah.
I think Martin, so that's on.
The Greenway, is it down there?
So you've got the greenway. I understand the greenway,
Yeah.
but just right of that greenway,
Down
just
around
right where
this.
your hand is now. Why is there a patch missing? Was it just regular housing? So up north.
And here.
Yeah, up
There's
north.
a,
bit
it's
more.
reserved.
Sorry.
Where am I looking? Yeah?
So yeah, that's it, right there.
There.
But to me, it looks like that's prime area for like medium density.
Probably because of the size, as I said, the size of the section. So if you're looking at the typical size of the section and these areas, you're looking at 1,012. So you just need to buy 2 sections
That's
and you
just
can
to
do
do
it.
with the subdivision in that area.
Whereas
already gone
here,
down.
they've
Okay,
already been carved down.
That's where you live now.
I know, that's what I'm asking.
The
I got a
airport,
7-storey building next to me.
the airport is also really interested in where density is under their flight path. So that's why this area here, so you'd think Victoria App, perfect. It's close to town. But unfortunately, we're stuck by that. It's also low land as well, so some of it's under 5 metre contour, so potential hazard risk in the future.
So the red is, you're saying that that's medium density, but you have to have 2,000 metres.
Yes. So that's something that we get argued with all the time. People say, why do I need to get 2,000 square metres to do that? And the idea behind it is so that it's developed comprehensively, so it's not one house stuck in behind each other. It's so that we can get some space like what Marie's showing in her plans of lots of good green space or interactive space around it. And that the parking doesn't necessarily take over the whole site, it can just be shoved over here in a corner if we even need it. So that was the reasoning for the 2,000. It's an area in our plan that we get criticised with a lot, but it's the reasoning behind it is so that we can get that good space around the buildings as well.
Is this all going to change when the government appeals the Resource Management Act?
We don't know. And zoning in the district plan probably won't change. It's just that we may have one regional district plan for the whole of South.
Right, it's 9:20, so it's... Jonathan, do you really want to say anything? No, he doesn't want to say
I
anything.
think the experts have put it succinctly.
Sounds like a pay rise.
Got my PDP.
Well, thank you to our speakers. You've given us some really good things to think about. And thank you to the questioners for being brave enough to put your hand up. We're all friends here. And this purple bit here, this red bit here, that's the original Invercargill city. So the oldest houses are there. Yeah. And our housing action group since 2008 has been trying to influence changes in that area. What we've suddenly got is people are starting to do their properties up. I think this is a result of COVID and spending their money locally. And because we give prizes to those people who do that, look after their gardens. So, who knows, our housing shortage may be resolved by multi-unit residents, which have a much smaller footprint per household, and maybe even be reconstituted in the CBD plan if we all contribute to the consultation. Next month we're going to do something a little different. It won't solve the housing shortage, but it does bring a perspective on the reuse, recycle psyche, a church conversion. That's the building, not the person. The owners have invited us to hold our public meeting on their premises. I'm not telling you where it is yet, because we haven't finished sorting out our marketing. It'll be a wonderful opportunity to see how good design can bring new life to an old building. The owner is a member of the South Alive Trust, and he took the trust on a tour a couple of years ago of his then unfinished project. And by the way, it's the church that I got married in, so it's a really good opportunity for me to go as well. So as I say, a wonderful opportunity to see this old building being given a new lease of life. Watch out for the advertising to find out where, and to sign up for your place on Thursday, May the 13th. Now you can enjoy your cuppa and chat, and if you've got any questions you feel have not been answered or you've thought of more, feel free to approach the speakers. Don't please bail them up in a corner, because somebody else might have their question as well. So thank you very much for coming.